Picture this. May 29th, 1176, a muddy field outside the town of Legnano in northern Italy. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, descendant of Charlemagne, sits on his warhorse watching something impossible unfold before him. His elite German knights, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, are being torn apart by Italian city militias, not professional soldiers, not noble warriors, shopkeepers, bankers, wool merchants, and craftsmen armed with crossbows and pikes, fighting under a massive war wagon called the Carroccio that carries Milan's banner and a field altar. The emperor charges personally into the melee, is unhorsed, disappears into the chaos, and for hours his men believe he's dead. When he finally stumbles back to his camp that night, bloodied and humiliated, the medieval world has changed forever. A merchant republic has just defeated a feudal empire. But how did Italy reach this extraordinary moment? To understand, we need to go back 700 years earlier to a quiet night in 476 AD when the Western Roman Empire finally died. The year is 476 AD. In Ravenna, the imperial capital of what remains of the Western Roman Empire, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus stands in a palace that feels far too large for him. His name is cruelly ironic, Romulus, after Rome's legendary founder, Augustulus, Little Augustus, after Rome's first emperor. But there's nothing grand about him. He's 16 years old, put on the throne by his father Orestes just 10 months ago, a puppet emperor with no real power. Outside the palace, a Germanic commander named Odoacer walks through the halls with his soldiers. He's not storming the gates like a barbarian raider. He's stepping into a role that history has already written for him, taking control of an empire that has been hollowing itself out for decades through civil wars, economic collapse, and endless Germanic invasions. Tonight, the fiction finally ends. The Western Roman Empire, which once ruled from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria, will cease to exist. With a bang, but with a tired sigh. What happened next was almost gentle. Odoacer didn't execute the boy emperor. He didn't parade him through the streets or throw him to the crowds. He simply removed him from power, gave him a pension, and sent him to live quietly in a villa in Campania. As then Odoacer did something even more remarkable. He gathered up all the imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the golden crown, the ceremonial sword, packed them carefully into chests, and shipped them across the Mediterranean to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno. The message was clear. There is only one Roman emperor now, and he rules from the East. Let me govern Italy as your patrician, your representative. Zeno accepted the arrangement. And just like that, after 1029 years, there was no longer an emperor in the West. The Roman Empire hadn't fallen in flames and destruction. It had simply stopped. Italy entered a new world, one where the old Roman systems would persist like ghosts, haunting every kingdom, every invasion, every attempt to rebuild what had been lost. Odoacer understood something crucial about power. If you destroy everything at once, even the conqueror has nowhere to stand. So he didn't burn Rome's bureaucracy to the ground. He embraced it. The Roman Senate still convened in Rome, though its authority was now mostly ceremonial, a theatre troupe performing for an audience that had left the building. Provincial governors still collected taxes using Roman methods. Scribes still copied legal documents in Latin. The postal system still functioned. The aqueducts still carried water. The old machinery of empire kept grinding forward, driven by inertia and habit, even though the emperor, who had supposedly controlled it, was gone. Italy under Odoacer looked remarkably similar to Italy under the last dozen Western emperors, which tells you how little those emperors had actually mattered by the end. For the Roman landowning elite, the transition was softened by a system called hospitality. Germanic warriors needed land and income, so they were settled on Roman estates throughout Italy, typically receiving 1/3 of each property. On paper, this was presented as temporary billeting of soldiers, the kind of thing Roman law had always allowed. In reality, it was permanent land confiscation, but it wasn't total destruction. The Roman landlords kept 2/3 of their estates and remained involved in managing them. The farms continued producing grain and olive oil, markets continued operating, coins still changed hands, still stamped with imperial symbols, even though the empire they represented was dead. The Gothic soldiers got their land and their legitimacy. The Roman aristocrats kept their lives and some of their wealth. Everyone pretended this was a normal administrative arrangement, not a revolutionary transfer of power. And because everyone pretended together, the system worked. Odoacer's army was relatively small, perhaps 20,000 men, but strategically placed in key fortresses and cities throughout the peninsula. He didn't need to garrison every village, he just needed to control the roads, the ports, the mountain passes, the river crossings, the bottlenecks where power naturally concentrates. His soldiers were a mix of different Germanic peoples, Heruli, Syrians, Rugians, and others who had served in the late Roman army and now transferred their loyalty to Odoacer personally. They were professional warriors, not tribal raiders. They understood Roman military organization, spoke enough Latin to function, and knew that their prosperity depended on keeping Italy stable and productive. What emerged was a strange hybrid. Roman laws enforced by Germanic swords, ancient cities ruled by new masters, a civilization suspended between its imperial past and an uncertain future. It wasn't Roman, and it wasn't quite barbarian. It was something in between, the first of many compromises that would define medieval Italy. At first, the arrangement seemed stable. Constantinople recognized Odoacer, and Italy enjoyed relative peace for the first time in decades. But empires are jealous creatures, and Odoacer's success made him dangerous. When he expanded into Dalmatia along the Adriatic coast and began interfering in the politics of neighboring kingdoms, the Eastern Emperor Zeno grew nervous. Italy was supposed to be a loyal province governed by an obedient patrician. Instead, it was starting to look like an independent kingdom with its own foreign policy. Zeno needed a solution, but he couldn't afford to send his own armies west when he faced threats closer to Constantinople. So he found a proxy, Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. Theodoric was a remarkable figure, half Roman, half barbarian, educated in Constantinople as a hostage during his youth, now leading a massive Gothic people numbering around 100,000 souls. Warriors, yes, but also women, children, elders, craftsmen, herds of livestock, wagons full of possessions, an entire nation on the move, searching for a homeland. They had been camped in the Balkans for years, sometimes allied with Constantinople, sometimes raiding it, always a problem that Zeno couldn't solve. So the emperor made Theodoric an offer. Invade Italy, defeat Odoacer, and you can rule it as my representative. If you succeed, you get a kingdom. If you fail, you die far away from my borders. Either way, you're no longer my problem. Theodoric accepted. In 488 AD, his entire people began the long march westward, crossing the Julian Alps into northern Italy. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a grinding, years-long war of attrition. Odoacer and Theodoric clashed at the Isonzo River, at Verona, at Milan, and dozens of smaller engagements. Cities were besieged, relieved, and besieged again. Countryside was ravaged by foraging armies. Refugees fled from one war zone into another. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. By 490 AD, Theodoric controlled most of northern Italy, but Odoacer held the impregnable fortress capital of Ravenna, surrounded by marshes and lagoons, supplied by sea, impossible to storm. The war settled into a brutal siege that would last 3 years. But Theodoric was patient. and when the siege finally ended, it would end not with Odoacer's victory or his honorable surrender, but with his murder at a feast. Ravenna was a nightmare to besiege. Built on a cluster of islands and marshlands protected by the shallow waters of the Po River Delta, the city was approachable only by narrow causeways that could be easily defended. Its harbour at Classa connected it to the Adriatic Sea, allowing supply ships to slip through Theodoric's blockade. The surrounding marshes bred mosquitoes and disease, devastating any army that camped there too long. Theodoric's soldiers built earthworks, dug siege lines, and even constructed a small fleet to patrol the waterways. But Ravenna simply wouldn't fall. Months turned into years. Men died of fever and starvation. Desertion became a problem. The siege turned into a waiting game to see whose will would break first. Finally, in February 493 AD, both sides were exhausted. Negotiations began, mediated by the local bishop. The agreement seemed reasonable. Theodoric and Odoacer would rule Italy jointly, sharing power as co-regents. Odoacer's soldiers would be integrated into Theodoric's army. The administrative apparatus would continue functioning under their combined authority. After 3 years of bloodshed and suffering, Italy would have peace under a dual kingship. Treaties were signed, oaths were sworn. On March 5, 493 AD, Theodoric entered Ravenna. The citizens, desperate for the siege to end, welcomed him with cautious relief. Perhaps the nightmare was finally over. 10 days later, on March 15th, the Ides of March, the same date Julius Caesar was assassinated, Theodoric invited Odoacer to a reconciliation banquet in the palace. They ate together, drank together, spoke of the future. And then, according to later accounts, Theodoric stood up, drew his sword, and struck Odoacer down with such force that the blade cleaved through his collarbone and deep into his chest. "Where is your god now?" witnesses reported Theodoric saying. Or perhaps the man had no bones. Different chroniclers recorded different words, but the result was the same. Odoacer died at the feast along with his brother and his key supporters, all killed in a coordinated purge. Theodoric emerged as sole ruler of Italy. The co-regency had lasted 10 days. The Gothic kingdom of Italy was born in blood and betrayal, and for the next 40 years Theodoric would rule as king. Theodoric ruled Italy for 33 years, from 493 to 526 AD, and what he built was remarkable: a functioning, prosperous kingdom that preserved Roman civilization while accommodating Gothic military power. He understood that legitimacy came not just from swords, but from symbols and systems, so he kept the Roman Senate functioning in Rome. He maintained the Roman legal code for Italian civilians. He appointed Roman aristocrats as administrators and advisors. He repaired aqueducts, roads, and public buildings. He even restored ancient monuments, seeing himself as the heir and protector of Roman grandeur. In his letters, written by his talented Roman secretary Cassiodorus, Theodoric presented himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as the guardian of Roman order, the man who had saved Italy from chaos. The key to making this work was a dual legal system. Goths lived under Gothic customary law, which emphasized personal honor, compensation for injuries, and the authority of warriors and chiefs. Romans lived under Roman written law, which emphasized property rights, contracts, and bureaucratic procedures. The two systems existed side by side, intersecting only when Goths and Romans had disputes with each other, which were handled by special mixed courts. Gothic soldiers provided military security but didn't interfere in civilian administration. Roman officials collected taxes and ran the government but had no military power. It was a careful balance, a marriage of convenience between two very different cultures, held together by Theodoric's personal authority and his genuine respect for Roman tradition. Theodoric's court at Ravenna became a showcase for this synthesis. The palace was decorated with Roman mosaics showing Theodoric in imperial purple, seated like an emperor. Church buildings rose in Roman architectural styles, but funded by Gothic royal patronage. Theodoric minted coins showing his image alongside Roman symbols, never quite claiming to be emperor, but certainly looking like one. He corresponded with other Germanic kings across Europe, with the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, and with the Pope in Rome, positioning himself as the most civilized ruler in the post-Roman West. For a generation, it worked. Gothic warriors and Roman civilians shared Italy's cities, and prosperity returned. Theodoric called himself King of the Goths and Romans, and for a brief shining moment that wasn't just propaganda, it was almost true. But there was one deep crack in the foundation: religion. Theodoric and most of his Gothic followers were Arian Christian. They believed that Christ the Son was created by and subordinate to God the Father. The Roman population and the Catholic Church followed Nicene Christianity. They believed in the Trinity with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as co-equal and co-eternal. So this might sound like theological hair-splitting, but in the 6th century it was the difference between salvation and heresy, between being part of the universal church and being a dangerous outsider. And it meant that the Gothic rulers and the Roman ruled were separated not just by ethnicity and law, but by their understanding of God himself. At first, Theodoric handled this with remarkable tolerance. He allowed Catholic bishops to function freely, the Pope to exercise spiritual authority, and Catholic churches to be built and maintained. He even supported church construction projects, recognizing that religious peace meant political stability. He told his subjects, "We cannot command religion, because no one is forced to believe against his will." This was an extraordinarily liberal position for the time, and it worked, as long as Theodoric remained strong and the balance held. Goths worshipped in their Arian churches, Romans in their Catholic churches, and the king presided over both as the protector of all Christians, regardless of sect. But over time, tensions grew. Some Catholic Romans resented being ruled by Arian heretics and looked to Constantinople, where the Eastern Emperor was Catholic, as their true spiritual and potentially political leader. Some Goths feared that their people were being absorbed into Roman culture, losing their identity and military edge. When prominent Catholic senators were accused of conspiring with Constantinople, charges that may or may not have been true, Theodoric's tolerance cracked. In his final years, he executed the famous philosopher Boethius and his father-in-law Symmachus on treason charges, and he pressured Pope John I when the Pope travelled to Constantinople. The aging king, once so careful with religious balance, was becoming paranoid and harsh. When Theodoric died in 526 AD, the careful edifice he'd built began to crumble almost immediately. Within a decade, Italy would be plunged into one of the most devastating wars in its history. The trouble came from Constantinople. Emperor Justinian III, who took power in 527 AD, was not content to rule half the old Roman world. He wanted it all back. North Africa, Spain, and especially Italy, the heartland of the Western Empire, all needed to be reconquered and reunited under Roman rule. This wasn't just ambition. Justinian believed it was his sacred duty, ordained by God to restore the empire to its ancient glory. When the Ostrogothic kingdom fell into succession disputes after Theodoric's death, weak kings, power struggles between Gothic nobles, growing resentment from the Roman population, Justinian saw his opportunity. In 535 AD, he sent his greatest general, Belisarius, to invade Italy. Belisarius had just finished conquering the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a lightning campaign that took only a few months, and Justinian expected Italy to fall just as quickly. Belisarius landed in Sicily, which surrendered almost without a fight. The Gothic garrison was small, the population Roman and Catholic, and many welcomed the imperial forces as liberators. From Sicily, Belisarius crossed to southern Italy, capturing Naples after a brief siege and then marching north toward Rome. The Byzantine army was relatively small, perhaps 15,000 men, but highly professional, well supplied by the imperial navy, and led by one of the most talented commanders of the age. The Gothic king, Witiges, realized too late how serious the threat was. In December 536 AD, Belisarius entered Rome almost unopposed, and the city that had once ruled the world now became the prize in someone else's war. Witiges gathered a massive Gothic army, reportedly over 100,000 men, though this was probably an exaggeration, and marched south to besiege Rome and crush the Byzantine invaders. What followed was one of the most dramatic sieges in medieval history, a year-long struggle that pitted Belisarius's skill and the ancient walls of Rome against the desperate fury of the Gothic nation. But this was just the beginning. The Gothic wars would drag on for nearly 20 years, and before they ended, Italy would be devastated beyond anything the barbarian invasions had achieved. The siege of Rome lasted from March 537 to March 538 AD, and it was brutal. Witiges surrounded the city with 7 massive camps, cutting all roads and attempting to starve out the defenders. Gothic warriors built siege towers, battering rams and mobile shelters, probing the ancient Aurelian walls for weak points. They cut the aqueducts, hoping to deprive the city of water, but many of Rome's wells still functioned, and Belisarius rationed supplies carefully. The population suffered terribly, but they held. Belisarius had only about 7,000 soldiers, but he used them brilliantly, sudden cavalry raids out of the gates to hit Gothic camps, archers on the walls raining arrows down on attackers, clever engineering to repair breaches and undermine Gothic siege works. The Goths tried everything. They attempted to block the Tiber River to flood parts of the city. They built towers taller than the walls and rolled them forward under protective covering. They even tried to infiltrate through the ancient sewers. Belisarius countered each move with improvisation and ruthless pragmatism. He turned the mausoleum of Hadrian, today's Castel Sant'Angelo, into a fortress, and his soldiers famously smashed its ancient statues to throw down as projectiles on Gothic attackers below. The cultural vandalism was shocking, but it worked. Month after month, the siege dragged on, both sides slowly bleeding out. Gothic supply lines were harassed by Byzantine naval forces operating from Naples. Disease and desertion weakened the Gothic army. Finally, in March 538, Witiges abandoned the siege and retreated north. Belisarius had held Rome, but at tremendous cost. The city's population had been ravaged by hunger and disease. The countryside around Rome was a wasteland of burned farms and abandoned villages, and worse, the war was nowhere near over. For the next 16 years, armies would march back and forth across Italy, besieging cities, raiding, starving populations, and destroying the infrastructure that had sustained Italy's prosperity for centuries. Cities like Milan and Pavia would be sacked multiple times. Entire regions would be depopulated. By the time the war finally ended in 554 AD, Italy had been transformed from a prosperous, densely populated land into a ghost of its former self, its cities emptied, its fields reverting to wilderness, its people reduced to perhaps half their pre-war numbers. The Gothic Wars didn't save Roman Italy, they destroyed it. After Belisarius's initial victories, the war became a grinding stalemate. Justinian recalled Belisarius to deal with threats in the east, leaving Italy under weaker commanders. The Goths rallied under a remarkable new king named Totila, who understood that military victory wasn't enough. He needed to win the support of the Italian population. So he did something revolutionary. He reduced taxes, protected Roman peasants from exploitation, redistributed land, and presented Gothic rule as liberation from Constantinople's harsh demands. For many ordinary Italians, this wasn't propaganda, it was their lived experience. Byzantine administrators and tax collectors were brutal and corrupt. squeezing the already suffering population to fund distant imperial projects. Totila's forces looked like saviors by comparison. Totila recaptured most of Italy between 541 and 543 AD. Rome changed hands multiple times, first Byzantine, then Gothic, then Byzantine again, each occupation bringing more destruction and suffering. In 546 AD, when Totila captured Rome, he found it almost abandoned. The ancient city that had once held over 1 million people now had perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, huddled in the ruins of former grandeur. Totila reportedly considered destroying Rome entirely, razing its walls and turning it into a pasture for cattle, symbolically ending the Roman myth forever. He didn't, but the fact that he considered it shows how far Rome had fallen. Finally, in 552 AD, Justinian sent a new commander, the elderly eunuch General Narses, leading a fresh army funded by stripping the empire's resources. Narses moved systematically, avoiding rash attacks, slowly pushing the Goths back. At the Battle of Busta Gallorum in the Apennine Mountains, the two armies finally met in decisive combat. Totila, wearing his finest armor and showing off his horsemanship before the battle, like a hero from the old stories, was killed in the fighting. His death broke Gothic resistance. Narses hunted down the remaining Gothic forces over the next 2 years, killing their leaders and scattering their armies. By 554 AD, organized Gothic resistance was finished. The Byzantine Empire had conquered Italy. The victory was total, complete, and utterly Pyrrhic. Italy was Roman again, but it was also ruined, depopulated, and bankrupt. Justinian had won the war, but what exactly had he won? In the aftermath, Justinian created a new administrative structure called the Exarchate of Ravenna to govern Italy. The exarch combined military and civil authority, essentially functioning as a viceroy representing the emperor. The idea was that Italy needed strong, centralized leadership to defend against future threats and extract enough taxes to pay for its own defense. The reality was that Italy was exhausted, its tax base decimated, its infrastructure shattered. Byzantine control was real in places like Ravenna, Rome, Naples, and the toe and heel of southern Italy, but large parts of the peninsula were effectively ungoverned, with local strongmen and bishops stepping into the vacuum left by collapsed imperial administration. The Gothic wars had done catastrophic damage. Archaeological evidence shows urban populations collapsing, fields being abandoned, sophisticated pottery production giving way to crude local wares, literacy declining outside church institutions, and infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, harbours, falling into ruin. Italy's population may have fallen by half or more between 535 and 565 AD. The old Roman social order, already weakened, was shattered. Great senatorial families disappeared from the historical record, their estates abandoned or seized. Cities shrank within their ancient walls, with people clustering around cathedrals and fortified points, leaving vast areas of former neighborhoods to crumble. Italy in 550 AD looked less like a province of the Roman Empire and more like a post-apocalyptic landscape where survivors huddled in the ruins of a vanished civilization. And Italy's troubles weren't over. In 568 AD, just 14 years after the Gothic Wars ended, another Germanic people crossed the Alps, the Lombards. By King Alboin, they came not as an army but as an entire migrating nation of perhaps 150,000 people looking for land to settle. Byzantine garrisons, depleted and exhausted, couldn't stop them. The Lombards poured into northern Italy, capturing cities like Milan, Pavia and Verona. They pushed south into central Italy, establishing duchies at Spoleto and Benevento. They never conquered all of Italy. Byzantine forces held Ravenna, Rome, Naples, and the far south, but they carved out a substantial kingdom that would last for over 200 years. Italy had fought for 2 decades to stay Roman, and the result was that it became more barbarian than ever before. The Lombards didn't arrive with a master plan for governing Italy. They came as a loose confederation of warrior bands and family groups, each led by powerful dukes who owed loyalty to King Alboin but retained enormous independence. When Alboin was assassinated in 572 AD, reportedly by his own wife Rosamund, seeking revenge for her father's death, the Lombard kingdom nearly fell apart. For 10 years, there was no king at all, just 36 independent dukes ruling their own territories like feudal warlords. They called this period the rule of the dukes, and it was chaos. Duchies fought each other, raided Byzantine territories, and squeezed the Italian population for everything they could extract. The Lombards were warriors, not administrators, and they had little interest in preserving Roman institutions. But gradually, necessity forced organization. The Byzantines counterattacked from their strongholds, and the Lombards realized that without coordination, they would be defeated piecemeal. In 584 AD, they elected a new king, Authari, and gave him real power, including half of all ducal lands, to fund a royal army. Over the next century, successive Lombard kings slowly built a functioning kingdom centered on Pavia in northern Italy. They adopted Latin as their administrative language. They wrote down their laws. The Edict of Rothari in 643 AD became one of the most important early medieval law codes, mixing Lombard customs with Roman legal concepts. They married into Roman aristocratic families. They converted from Arianism to Catholic Christianity, bringing them into alignment with their Roman subjects and with the Pope. By the 8th century, under kings like Liutprand, 712-744 AD, the Lombard kingdom had become a sophisticated state. Liutprand revised the law codes, patronized monasteries, built churches, and even made a pilgrimage to Monte Cassino to honor Saint Benedict. He expanded Lombard territory steadily, pressuring the remaining Byzantine holdings and even threatening Rome itself. The Lombards were no longer barbarian invaders. They had become Italian rulers, and their kingdom looked like it might eventually unite the entire peninsula under one crown. But this made them dangerous to the one power in Italy that valued its independence above all: the papacy. The popes had survived Goths, Byzantines, and early Lombards by playing different powers against each other. Now, facing a strong Lombard kingdom on their doorstep, they needed a new protector. They would find one north of the Alps. The Frankish kingdom under the Carolingian dynasty was rising as the dominant power in Western Europe. Charles Martel had stopped the Muslim advance at Tours in 732 AD. His son, Pepin the Short, had made a crucial deal with the papacy. In 751 AD, Pope Zacharias approved Pepin's overthrow of the old Merovingian dynasty, giving him religious legitimacy, and in return, Pepin promised military protection for the Pope against the Lombards. When Lombard king Aistulf besieged Rome in 754-756 AD, Pepin marched into Italy twice, defeated the Lombards, and granted captured territories to the Pope, creating what became known as the Papal States, and directly ruled by the Pope as a temporal sovereign. This donation of Pepin transformed the papacy from a spiritual authority into a territorial power with lands to defend and an army to maintain. Pepin's son Charlemagne inherited this alliance and expanded it into something far grander. When Lombard king Desiderius attacked papal territory in 772 AD, Pope Hadrian I called for Frankish help. Charlemagne saw opportunity. Conquering Italy would make him the most powerful ruler since Rome's fall, and it came with papal blessing. In 773 AD, he led a massive Frankish army over the Alps, bypassing Lombard fortifications through mountain passes. He besieged Desiderius in Pavia through the winter of 773-774, a grinding test of will and supplies. When Pavia finally surrendered in June 774, Charlemagne did something clever. He didn't destroy the Lombard kingdom, he took it over. He crowned himself King of the Lombards, kept Lombard laws and administrators in place where useful, and grafted Frankish military power onto Italian structures. For the next 30 years, Charlemagne ruled a vast empire stretching from northern Spain to the Elbe River, from the North Sea to central Italy. He crushed the Saxon tribes in brutal decades-long campaigns. He established a vast network of counts and bishops as administrators. He promoted learning and literacy, the Carolingian Renaissance, with scholars like Alcuin of York establishing schools and copying classical texts. And in 800 AD, on Christmas Day, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Whether Charlemagne knew this was coming or was surprised by it, the message was clear: the Western Roman Empire was reborn, with a Frankish warrior as its head and the Pope as its spiritual authority. For Italy, this meant security and order, but also subservience to a foreign ruler who spoke a different language and governed from north of the Alps. Charlemagne's coronation in 800 AD was a watershed moment. For the first time since 476, there was a Western emperor, and his legitimacy came explicitly from the Pope. This created a partnership, but also a tension that would define European politics for centuries. Who was superior, emperor or pope? Who crowned whom? Could the Pope depose an emperor? Could an emperor appoint popes? These questions were left unanswered in 800, simmering beneath the surface. For Italy, the immediate impact was stability. Frankish counts and bishops governed key cities. Charlemagne visited Italy multiple times, holding courts, judging cases, and receiving oaths of loyalty. Italian elites, both Lombard and Roman, were integrated into the Carolingian system, serving as administrators, diplomats, and military commanders. But after Charlemagne died in 814 AD, his empire began to fracture. His son Louis the Pious struggled to hold the vast territories together. When Louis died in 840, his three sons fought a brutal civil war that ended with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, dividing the empire into three kingdoms. Italy became part of the Middle Kingdom under Emperor Lothair, but Lothair's portion was geographically incoherent, a strip running from the Netherlands through Burgundy to Italy, and when he died, further divisions followed. By the late 800s, multiple Carolingian relatives claimed the Italian crown, fighting each other with armies drawn from local Italian magnates who played different claimants against each other for their own advantage. The result was political chaos. Figures like Guy of Spoleto, Berengar of Friuli, and Lambert of Tuscany all claimed to be King of Italy at various points, sometimes with imperial titles added on top. They were crowned in Pavia, held ceremonial courts, issued diplomas and charters, but actual control rarely extended beyond their core territories and the armies their wealth could buy. Italy was nominally part of a Carolingian empire, but in reality it was fragmenting into regional power bases controlled by margraves, dukes and counts who might acknowledge a king but largely governed themselves. The idea of empire remained powerful. Everyone wanted the title, but the reality was dissolution. The Carolingian dream of a unified Christian empire was dying, and in its place came the long Italian medieval pattern: fragmentation, localism, and the rise of strongmen. By the late 9th century, central authority in Italy had effectively collapsed. Local magnates built castles on strategic hilltops, each becoming a center of independent power. These weren't just military fortifications, they were administrative centers, economic hubs, and symbols of authority. A powerful count or margrave might control dozens of castles, each garrisoned with his personal soldiers, each extracting taxes and tolls from surrounding territories. The old Roman roads became dangerous, lined with castles whose lords charged fees or simply robbed travelers. Merchants had to negotiate safe passage through patchworks of jurisdictions. Peasants found themselves subject to new lords who demanded labor service, food rents, and military support. The church became deeply entangled in this localized power structure. Bishops were often appointed from local noble families and functioned as much as territorial princes as spiritual leaders. The papacy itself fell under the control of powerful Roman aristocratic families, the Theophylacti, the Crescenti, who fought each other for control of the Lateran Palace and the right to appoint popes. Between 897 and 964 AD, there were 24 different popes, many appointed by rival families, some deposed violently, several murdered. The papal pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, as scandalized later chroniclers called it, reached its nadir when Marozia, a powerful Roman noblewoman, allegedly installed her illegitimate son as Pope John XIV and controlled papal affairs through her family network. Think about what this meant. The spiritual head of Western Christianity, the successor of St. Peter, was chosen not through prayer or merit, but through Roman family politics and occasionally violence. Popes issued decrees and held synods, but their authority outside Rome was increasingly theoretical. Meanwhile, Italy's cities, Milan, Verona, Florence, Pisa, and others, were growing wealthier through trade and manufacturing, even as political authority fractured. Bishops and local notables began exercising real power, making decisions about defense, justice, and taxation without reference to distant kings or emperors. Italy was still waiting for someone strong enough to impose order. That someone was about to cross the Alps from Germany. In Germany, a new royal dynasty had emerged, the Ottonians, Saxon rulers who had unified the German duchies and defeated the Magyar raiders threatening Central Europe. Otto I became King of Germany in 936 AD, and like Charlemagne before him, he looked south to Italy with imperial ambitions. When Italian magnates invited him to intervene in their power struggles, and when the Pope appealed for protection against local Roman nobles, Otto saw his opportunity. In 951 AD, he made his first Italian campaign, married the widowed Italian queen Adelaide, and took the title King of the Lombards. But he returned to Germany before consolidating control. It would take another decade before he could make his imperial dream reality. In 962 AD, Otto returned to Italy with a powerful army, defeated his rivals, and marched into Rome. On February 2nd, Pope John IV crowned him emperor, reviving the imperial title that had lapsed after the Carolingian collapse. This marked the beginning of what historians later called the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that linked Germany and northern Italy under one imperial crown for the next 850 years. Otto's model was explicitly Carolingian. He claimed to be Charlemagne's successor, ruling a Christian empire with the Pope as his spiritual partner. But Otto was also pragmatic. He extracted the Ottonianum from the Pope, a document guaranteeing imperial approval for future papal elections, effectively making the emperor the Pope's overlord in temporal matters. Otto and his successors, Otto the Angered, Otto III, and Henry II, tried to govern Italy through a combination of military power, loyal bishops appointed as administrators, and alliances with local magnates. They created a system of imperial bishops, churchmen who owed their positions to the emperor, governed territories as his representatives, and provided troops for imperial campaigns. These bishop princes became key figures in both German and Italian politics. In Italy, imperial control was strongest in the north. Pavia remained the nominal capital of the Italian kingdom. Verona and other cities had strong imperial garrisons, but central and southern Italy remained more autonomous. The Lombard duchies of Spoleto and Benevento played Byzantines, Germans, and the papacy against each other. Meanwhile, something new was stirring in Italy's cities, a sense of local identity, economic power, and impatience with rule by distant foreigners. Between 1000 and 1100 AD, northern Italian cities underwent a quiet revolution. Trade expanded dramatically as Mediterranean commerce revived. Merchants grew wealthy importing spices, silk, and luxury goods from the east, and exporting Italian woolcloth, metalwork and wine. Craft guilds organized artisans, weavers, dyers, metalworkers, leather workers, giving them collective power to regulate quality, prices and training. Urban populations swelled as people moved from the countryside seeking opportunity. Cities like Milan, Florence, Genoa, Pisa and Venice became centers of economic dynamism, far wealthier and more sophisticated than the rural castles where counts and bishops held traditional power. These urban communities began to assert self-government. Merchants and guildmasters didn't want every dispute settled by a distant count who might be corrupt or incompetent. They didn't want arbitrary taxes imposed by imperial officials. They wanted control over their own affairs, so they created something revolutionary, the commune, a sworn association of citizens who pledged to support each other, defend the city, and govern themselves through elected officials called consuls, usually 12 consuls serving one-year terms, drawn from prominent merchant and artisan families, making decisions collectively through councils and assemblies. The commune became a legal entity, capable of making treaties, raising armies, collecting taxes and enforcing laws, a city-state in everything but name. This was radical. Medieval society was supposed to be hierarchical, king above nobles, nobles above clergy, clergy above commoners, everyone in their ordained place. The communes said, "We are citizens, not subjects. We rule ourselves through elected councils, not hereditary lords. We defend ourselves with citizen militias, not by appealing to distant kings." When communes went to war, they carried a massive four-wheeled war wagon called a carroccio into battle, bearing the city's banner, an altar where priests said mass, and trumpeters who signaled orders. The carroccio symbolized the commune's identity, sacred, collective, citizen-based power. Defending the carroccio became the highest honor. Losing it in battle was devastating shame. Italian cities were inventing a new kind of politics, and they were willing to fight for it. This communal independence was bound to clash with imperial authority. When Frederick Barbarossa became Holy Roman Emperor in 1152, he brought iron determination to restore imperial control over Italy. Frederick was an impressive figure, tall, red-bearded, hence Barbarossa, an experienced warrior and a student of Roman law who believed that cities owed obedience to the emperor as a legal obligation, not a favor. In 1158 he called the Diet of Roncaglia, a great assembly of imperial lawyers, bishops and Italian representatives, where he laid out his vision. The emperor held supreme authority over roads, markets, tolls, justice and military service throughout Italy. Imperial officials would govern cities, imperial courts would judge cases, imperial taxes would be paid. Communal autonomy was illegal usurpation of rightful imperial power. For cities like Milan, proud, wealthy, and used to self-government, this was intolerable. When Milan refused to comply with imperial demands and continued expanding its influence over neighboring cities, Frederick responded with overwhelming force. He besieged Milan in 1158, forcing submission and heavy tribute. But the Milanese soon rebelled again, and Frederick's patience ended. In 1162, after a devastating siege that starved the city into surrender, Frederick ordered Milan destroyed. The walls were torn down stone by stone, buildings were demolished, the population was scattered into 4 separate villages in the surrounding countryside. Salt was symbolically ploughed into the ruins. Frederick wanted to make Milan an example. This is what happens to cities that defy imperial authority. But the destruction of Milan shocked Italy and backfired politically. Instead of terrorizing other communes into obedience, it galvanized resistance. Exiled Milanese leaders traveled to other cities, showing their wounds, telling their stories, pleading for solidarity. Other communes realized that if Milan, the largest, richest, most powerful city in Lombardy, could be destroyed, then none of them were safe. Frederick wasn't just enforcing imperial rights, he was threatening the entire communal way of life. If communes wanted to survive, they would have to stand together, and in 1167 they did exactly that, forming the Lombard League. The Lombard League began as an alliance of 16 cities, eventually growing to include more than 30 communes across northern Italy. Milan, Venice, Verona, Padua, Vicenza, Bologna, Cremona, Brescia, and many others pledged mutual defense. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. They pooled resources to build coordinated fortifications. They founded a new city, Alessandria, named after Pope Alexander III, who supported the League, specifically as a military stronghold, blocking key imperial routes. Most importantly, they created a unified army, thousands of citizen soldiers from different cities, training together, coordinating strategies, and learning to fight as a single force, rather than isolated urban militias. Frederick Barbarossa was stunned by this development. He had expected cities to compete with each other, to be played off against each other, to fragment under pressure. Instead, they had united. Over the next decade, Frederick campaigned repeatedly in Italy, besieging cities, burning crops, trying to break the League's will. The League responded with guerrilla tactics, scorched earth policies, and economic warfare, cutting imperial supply lines, bribing imperial allies to defect, and exhausting Frederick's forces with long sieges and ambushes. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. By 1176, both were exhausted, and Frederick decided to risk everything on one final confrontation. The armies met near Legnano, northwest of Milan, on May 29, 1176. Frederick commanded perhaps 3,000 heavily armored German knights, the finest cavalry in Europe, veterans of decades of warfare. The League fielded approximately 15,000 soldiers, mostly infantry, crossbowmen, pikemen, and militia, armed with spears and shields, supported by perhaps 1,000 mounted sergeants. On paper, Frederick should have won. Heavy cavalry charges had dominated European battlefields for centuries, but the League infantry fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the end of their independence. They formed tight defensive formations around their carroccio, using pikes to stop cavalry charges and crossbows to shoot down knights. When Frederick personally led a charge into the center, he was unhorsed and disappeared into the fighting. For hours, his men believed he was dead. The Battle of Legnano was a stunning upset victory for the Lombard League. Frederick survived. He escaped the battlefield bruised and humiliated, but his army was scattered and his aura of invincibility was shattered. News of the victory spread across Europe. Italian cities had defeated the Holy Roman Emperor. Citizen militias had beaten professional knights. The communal experiment had survived its greatest test. Pope Alexander III, who had backed the League and excommunicated Frederick, was vindicated. For Italian communes, Legnano became a founding myth, proof that free cities defending their liberty could triumph over imperial tyranny. Even today, May 29th is celebrated in some northern Italian cities, and Legnano resonates as a symbol of communal independence. But Frederick was a realist. He couldn't win a prolonged war against a united League while also managing problems in Germany. So he negotiated. The Peace of Constance, signed in 1183, was a compromise that recognized new political realities. The emperor retained his title, certain symbolic rights, and some judicial authority, including the right to appoint imperial judges for major cases and to receive oaths of loyalty. But the cities won the substance. They could elect their own consuls, govern internal affairs, maintain their militias, control most taxation, and form alliances with each other. Imperial authority in northern Italy became largely theoretical. Communes would pay lip service to the emperor, occasionally ask for his confirmation of their rights, but in practice govern themselves. Inside the communes, politics continued evolving. The early consular system, where 12 consuls from leading families governed collectively, often led to bitter factional conflicts. prominent families feuded over offices, policies, and personal grudges. To reduce this instability, many communes began hiring an outsider as chief magistrate, the podesta. He came from another city, served for 1 year, sometimes extended to 2, was paid a substantial salary, and brought his own staff of judges and notaries. The idea was that an outsider would be neutral, ruling according to written law rather than family loyalty. This professionalization of government was another Italian innovation, politics as a career requiring expertise, not just noble birth. While the inland communes fought for independence, Italy's coastal cities turned outward toward the sea. The maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, built their power on trade, turning the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. Venetian merchants dominated trade with Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, importing silk, spices, and precious goods. Genoese ships traded with Muslim North Africa and Spain, buying sugar, cotton, and exotic products. Pisan fleets raided Muslim ports, bringing back slaves and treasure. These cities built enormous wealth on commerce, and with wealth came military power, war fleets, fortified harbours, and colonies in distant ports. Venice developed the most sophisticated political system. The city-state was governed by a doge, an elected duke, but his power was carefully limited by councils of merchant nobles. The Great Council, eventually comprising hundreds of patrician families, elected the doge and controlled major decisions. The Senate handled foreign policy and war. The Council of Ten managed security and intelligence, operating with frightening efficiency to suppress conspiracies. Venetian government emphasized stability, collective decision-making, and preventing any single family from dominating, a republican oligarchy that lasted for over 1,000 years. The city's wealth was staggering. Its arsenal shipyard could build a galley in a single day, its treasury financed wars across the Mediterranean, and its Piazza San Marco gleamed with gold looted from Constantinople. Genoa was more turbulent, with powerful families like the Doria and Spinola competing for control, but equally successful at sea. Pisa dominated the western Mediterranean until crushed by Genoa in the 13th century. Think about what these republics achieved: city-states without significant agricultural hinterlands, built on lagoons or narrow coastal strips, yet wealthy enough to hire armies, build fleets, and establish colonies from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. They proved that commerce and naval power could rival the landed wealth of traditional kingdoms. And far to the south, the Kingdom of Sicily under Norman and then Hohenstaufen rulers showed yet another path: centralized monarchy with professional bureaucracy, mixing Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Norman influences into one of medieval Europe's most advanced states. The relationship between emperor and pope, already strained, reached crisis with Frederick II. Crowned emperor in 1220, Frederick was also king of Sicily, giving him control of southern Italy, which meant the Papal States were surrounded by imperial territory. This was the Pope's nightmare, a powerful emperor controlling them geographically and potentially politically. Frederick was brilliant, multilingual, speaking Latin, German, French, Italian, Arabic, and Greek, scientifically curious and religiously unorthodox. He founded the University of Naples to train loyal officials without church control. He imposed state monopolies on key industries. He taxed church property. He appointed his own men as bishops. To reform-minded popes, Frederick looked like a secular tyrant threatening the entire Christian order. The conflict exploded when Frederick delayed his promised crusade, was excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX in 1227, but then went on crusade anyway in 1228 while still excommunicated, and succeeded through diplomacy rather than warfare, negotiating a treaty that returned Jerusalem to Christian control without a single major battle. Pope Gregory was furious, an excommunicated emperor, leading a crusade and succeeding through negotiations with Muslims. This violated every papal expectation about how crusades should work. Frederick's success made him more popular and made the Pope look petty. The propaganda war escalated. Popes called Frederick the Antichrist. Frederick called popes corrupt hypocrites, and Italy became their battlefield. At Cortenuova in 1237, Frederick annihilated a Lombard League army, capturing Milan's sacred Carroccio and parading it through Italy as a trophy. He seemed unstoppable, imposing harsh controls on rebellious cities and trying to convert northern Italy from a patchwork of independent communes into an imperial province with appointed officials. But papal diplomacy worked tirelessly, building new anti-imperial coalitions, excommunicating Frederick repeatedly, and preaching crusade against the emperor as if he were a Muslim invader. The struggle consumed Italy for decades, armies ravaging the countryside, cities expelled from leagues and alliances, families torn apart by factional loyalties. When Frederick died suddenly in 1250, many believed God had finally struck down the papal enemy, but the chaos he unleashed would continue for generations. The struggle between Frederick II and the papacy crystallized Italian politics into two factions: Guelphs, supporting the Pope, and Ghibellines, supporting the emperor. These labels spread like wildfire, dividing cities, neighborhoods, and families. In Florence, the Guelphs and Ghibellines fought street battles, built fortified towers to defend their quarters, and repeatedly expelled each other from the city. In Genoa, the factions mapped onto competing merchant clans fighting for control of the Republic. In Siena, Bologna, Verona, everywhere, Guelph and Ghibelline became the primary political identities, determining who you could marry, who you could do business with, and whether you lived or died in the next factional purge. But here's the complexity: the factions weren't purely ideological. Yes, Guelphs theoretically favoured papal authority and Ghibellines favoured imperial power, but in practice the labels became markers for local rivalries that had nothing to do with pope or emperor. A family might be Guelph because their traditional enemies were Ghibelline, or because Guelph Alliance offered access to papal banking contracts, or simply because their ancestors had chosen that side generations ago. People switched sides when convenient. Cities changed alignment based on which faction controlled the government. Guelph and Ghibelline became team colours in an endless game of Italian political violence. After Frederick's death in 1250, his son Conrad, and then his grandson Conradin, tried to maintain Hohenstaufen power in Italy. But papal diplomacy had found a powerful ally: Charles of Anjou, brother of King Louis IX of France. The papacy invited Charles to conquer Sicily and eliminate the Hohenstaufen line forever. Charles did so brutally. At the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268, Angevin forces defeated Conradin's army. The 16-year-old Conradin was captured, put on trial for rebellion against the church, and publicly beheaded in Naples, an execution that shocked Europe. The papal Angevin alliance had won. Imperial power in Italy was broken. But this created a new problem. Without an emperor to balance against the pope, who would check papal power? And without either emperor or pope able to impose order, Italy fragmented even further into its constituent city-states. With imperial authority shattered after 1250 and Guelph-Ghibelline violence exhausting the communes, Italian cities began transforming again. The republican governments designed for cooperation among merchant oligarchs struggled to manage increasingly violent factions and complex economies. Many communes faced constant instability, governments overthrown every few years, exiles returning with armies, vendetta killings in the streets. In this environment, a new solution emerged, concentrating power in a single strongman, the Signore, Lord. At first, this looked temporary. A city might grant emergency powers to a military captain or podestar just until the crisis passes. But crises have a way of persisting, and emergency powers tend not to be returned. Families like the Visconti in Milan, the Scaligeri in Verona, the Este in Ferrara, and the Gonzaga in Mantua parlayed temporary commands into permanent lordships. They kept communal councils and offices functioning. Consuls still met, councils still voted. But real decisions came from the signore's private council. The commune became a decorative shell around a princely core. These signori invested heavily in professional government. They hired trained lawyers and notaries to run bureaucracies. They maintained mercenary armies, companies of professional soldiers commanded by condottieri, military contractors who fought for whoever paid them. They built fortified palaces that were fortress, part administrative centre, part cultural showcase. The signori also became patrons of arts and learning, using culture as political propaganda. Giotto painted frescoes showing signori as wise rulers blessed by God. Petrarch dedicated poems to signori, praising their magnificence. Universities trained officials for signorial courts. A new type of Italian state was emerging, the Renaissance principality, where one-man rule was justified not by feudal inheritance, but by effective government and cultural sophistication. Milan under the Visconti family shows this transformation clearly. The Visconti began as minor nobles serving as archbishops of Milan. Through a combination of family alliances, military force, and political cunning, they gradually eliminated rivals and seized control of the city. Archbishop Ottone Visconti defeated the rival Torriani family in 1277. His successors consolidated power through strategic marriages and military expansion. By 1294 they secured an imperial title, imperial vicar, giving legal cover to what was already reality. The Visconti ruled Milan. But they didn't just extract wealth, they organized the city systematically. Tax collection became more efficient with professional revenue officials and detailed records. The Visconti reformed Milan's courts, codified laws, and established appeals procedures. They expanded Milanese territory relentlessly, conquering or intimidating neighboring cities until Milan controlled much of Lombardy. Under Gian Galeazzo Visconti, 1378-1402, Milan became a near kingdom, one of the largest states in Italy. Gian Galeazzo even bought the title Duke of Milan from the German Emperor for 100,000 florins, transforming the signoria into a legally recognized duchy. The Visconti court became a showcase for wealth and culture. They built the massive Castello Sforzesco Palace. They founded the Certosa di Pavia Monastery, one of Italy's most beautiful buildings. They patronized poets, musicians, and artists. They commissioned illuminated manuscripts of stunning beauty. This wasn't just vanity, it was statecraft. By appearing cultured, pious, and magnificent, the Visconti legitimized their rule in ways that military force alone couldn't. Other signori across Italy followed similar patterns. The Scaligeri built elaborate Gothic tombs in Verona. The Este made Ferrara a center of refined court culture. The Gonzaga turned Mantua into an artistic jewel. Each signoria was different, some cruel, some relatively just, but together they transformed northern and central Italy from a patchwork of communes into a collection of princely states. While secular powers rose, the papacy struggled with its own contradictions. Having defeated the empire, the popes found themselves ruling the Papal States, a band of territories across central Italy from Rome to the Adriatic, which required armies, taxes, and fortresses to control. Spiritual ideals collided with political necessity. How could the Pope be a spiritual shepherd while also besieging rebellious cities and executing political enemies? Many Christians found this troubling, and the tension never resolved. In 1309, under pressure from French King Philip IV and seeking to escape violent Roman factional politics, Pope Clement V moved the papal court to Avignon in southern France. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, popes resided in Avignon, governing Italy through legates and relying heavily on French advisors and money. Many Italians saw this as betrayal, a Babylonian captivity of the Church. Papal taxation increased dramatically to fund the Avignon court's expenses. Cardinal Albornoz led brutal military campaigns in the 1350s to reconquer the Papal States, building fortress cities and imposing harsh rule. The papacy had become in part just another Italian territorial state, complete with armies, taxes, and the usual political violence. Then in 1378 disaster struck, the Great Western Schism. When Pope Gregory VI died shortly after returning to Rome from Avignon, cardinals under pressure from Roman mobs elected an Italian pope, Urban VI. But Urban was harsh and erratic, alienating the cardinals, who fled Rome, and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Now there were two popes, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter, each excommunicating the other. In 1409, a church council tried to resolve this by deposing both popes and electing a third, but the first two refused to step down, so now there were three popes. For nearly 40 years, Western Christianity was split, with different kingdoms, cities, and bishops recognizing different popes. The moral authority of the papacy, already strained, was shattered. The Great Schism turned papal politics into farce. Italian signori and communes backed whichever pope offered them the best deal. Tax exemptions, legitimization of their rule, appointment of friendly bishops. Condottieri, mercenary captains, sold their services to papal armies on all sides, treating the schism as a business opportunity. The most famous condottieri, like Hawkwood's White Company and Sforza's mercenary forces, grew rich from religious conflict, hired to fight papal wars that everyone knew were more political than spiritual. The schism damaged Christianity's institutional authority profoundly. If there could be three popes simultaneously excommunicating each other, which one truly held the keys to heaven? For ordinary believers, this was deeply disturbing. For skeptical intellectuals, it was proof that church politics had become corrupt theatre. The crisis was finally resolved at the Council of Constance, 1414-1418, which deposed all three claimants and elected Martin V as pope, recognized by most of Western Christianity. But the damage lingered. The councils that resolved the schism had claimed authority over popes, raising questions about whether general councils of bishops might be superior to papal monarchy, a constitutional crisis within the Church. Yet paradoxically, this chaos created space for new ideas. If authority at the top could be questioned, perhaps authority generally could be examined more critically. In Italy's cities and courts, thinkers were already exploring human experience with new intensity. Petrarch, 1304-1374, had hunted for lost classical manuscripts, written letters to dead Roman authors, and reflected deeply on his own inner life with a modern psychological intensity. Boccaccio, 1313-1375, wrote the Decameron, 100 earthy, funny, sometimes scandalous tales about merchants, nobles, clergy, and commoners navigating life during the Black Death. Dante, 1265-1321, had already written the Divine Comedy in Italian vernacular rather than Latin, making high literature accessible beyond the clergy. These writers weren't abandoning Christianity, they were deeply religious, but they placed human perspectives and emotions at the center of their work in new ways. Meanwhile, Venice was quietly building something extraordinary. The Serenissima, most serene republic, expanded from its lagoon onto the mainland, terra firma, in the 14th and 15th centuries. Venice conquered Padua, Verona, Vicenza, Brescia, and other cities, securing routes between its ports and the interior and protecting its trade networks from hostile neighbors. Venetian rule promised stable laws, reliable coinage, and protection for commerce. Subject cities maintained some autonomy, their own councils and laws, but ultimate authority rested with governors sent from Venice, rotating frequently to prevent them from building independent power bases. Venice managed this empire with remarkable administrative sophistication. The patrician government in the lagoon, dominated by perhaps 200 merchant families who held hereditary membership in the Great Council, operated through interlocking councils, committees, and magistracies. No single individual could dominate. The Doge was impressive ceremonially but constrained practically. The Senate handled foreign policy, and the Council of Ten managed internal security with ruthless efficiency. This distributed power system prevented coups and civil wars while allowing effective decision-making. Venice became famous for stability, continuity, and calculated policy, quite different from the turbulent factional politics of Florence or Milan. The city itself became a dazzling showcase of wealth. The Rialto Bridge spanned the Grand Canal, lined with shops selling luxury goods. The Arsenal shipyard was Europe's largest industrial complex, capable of building a fully equipped war galley in a single day using assembly line methods. St. Mark's Basilica glittered with gold mosaics and treasures looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. The Doge's palace combined Byzantine, Gothic, and Islamic architectural elements into something uniquely Venetian. Merchants from across the known world, Armenians, Greeks, Germans, Turks, Arabs, conducted business in Venetian fondacy trading houses, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere unmatched anywhere in Europe. Venice proved that an aristocratic republic, deeply commercial, could rule both sea and land, combining maritime and territorial power. All these political structures, communes, signory, papal states, maritime republics, rested on an increasingly sophisticated economy. Italian merchants operated across the known world, in London, Bruges, and the Champagne fairs in northern Europe, in Constantinople, Alexandria, and Syrian ports in the east, in Tunis and Morocco in North Africa. They dominated international banking, developing instruments like bills of exchange that allowed money to move safely across long distances without transporting actual coins. The Bardi, Peruzzi, and Medici banks in Florence became financial powerhouses, lending to kings and popes, financing trade, and accumulating enormous wealth. Urban industries flourished. Florence's wool industry transformed raw English wool into high-quality cloth sold throughout Europe, employing thousands of workers in a complex production chain: wool importers, beaters, carders, spinners, weavers, dyers, finishers, and merchants. Guilds regulated each step, maintaining quality standards and training apprentices through a formal system. The Arte della Lana Wool Guild became one of Florence's most powerful institutions, its wealth funding churches, hospitals, and public buildings. Similar specialized industries developed elsewhere: silk in Lucca and Venice, armor and weapons in Milan, glass in Venice, ceramics in central Italian towns. This concentration of capital and skilled labor allowed Italian cities to fund not just economic activity but cultural production on an unprecedented scale. Wealthy merchants and bankers like the Medici in Florence, the Visconti in Milan, the Este in Ferrara became patrons of arts and learning. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and architecture. They collected manuscripts and funded scholars. They hosted poets and philosophers at their courts. Banking families competed for prestige through cultural patronage, turning Italian cities into artistic powerhouses. Walk through a late 14th century Italian city at dusk. Bells ring from multiple churches, workshops close for the night. In a banker's palazzo, accountants work by candlelight balancing ledgers. On a nearby piazza, masons and painters prepare scaffolding for tomorrow's work on a cathedral facade. Thousands of ordinary workers, artisans, laborers, merchants, were building the physical and economic foundation for the Renaissance explosion of culture that was about to transform Europe. Culturally, Italy in the 13th and 14th centuries was already experiencing a renaissance before the capital R Renaissance. Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, exiled from Florence by factional violence, wrote the Divine Comedy in Italian vernacular rather than Latin, making it accessible to educated non-clergy. His journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise was theological vision, but also sharp political commentary. He populated the afterlife with recent Italians, friends and enemies, popes and princes settling scores and offering judgments on contemporary politics. Dante showed that vernacular literature could achieve philosophical and artistic heights previously reserved for Latin. Francesco Petrarch, 1304–1374, is often called the father of humanism. He collected classical manuscripts, literally digging through monastery libraries to find forgotten texts. He wrote letters to ancient authors, Cicero, Livy, Virgil, treating them as living conversation partners across the centuries. He reflected intensely on his own psychological states, writing sonnets about his unrequited love for Laura that examined human emotion with unprecedented introspection. Petrarch loved both classical wisdom and his own age, and he helped create an intellectual movement that placed human experience, language, and history at the center of inquiry. This humanism didn't reject Christianity. Petrarch was deeply devout, but it insisted that studying classical culture and human nature was valuable in itself. In visual arts, painters like Giotto di Bondone, 1267–1337, began revolutionizing representation. Giotto's frescoes in Padua's Scrovegni Chapel and Florence's Santa Croce showed figures with weight, volume, and emotional expression. Faces displayed genuine sorrow, tenderness, and fear. Buildings and landscapes suggested three-dimensional space. Stories from scripture and saints' lives unfolded with dramatic intensity and psychological realism. Compared to earlier medieval paintings with their flat gold backgrounds and stylized figures, Giotto's work looked startlingly lifelike. Architecture soared upward. The cathedrals of Siena, Florence, and Milan rose in marble and stone, their facades like sculpted sermons, their interiors filled with colored light through stained glass. Italian cities were becoming stages for displaying memory and aspiration, where past, present, and future were carved and painted into every available surface. By 1400, Italy was not a unified kingdom, but a mosaic of competing states. Milan under the Visconti, Florence dominated by merchant oligarchs, soon to be the Medici, Venice ruling its maritime empire, Genoa controlling Mediterranean trade routes, the Papal States struggling to maintain cohesion across central Italy, the Kingdom of Naples in the south, and dozens of smaller powers, Mantua, Ferrara, Siena, Lucca, Rimini, each with its own ambitions, armies, and alliances. This fragmentation was dangerous, making Italy vulnerable to foreign invasion. But it also created fierce, fertile competition in politics, economics, art, and ideas. City-states competed for the best artists, the most innovative bankers, the strongest armies, the most magnificent buildings. This competition drove innovation. The long arc from 4176 to 1400 had seen extraordinary transformations. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, replaced by Germanic kingdoms that preserved some Roman structures while introducing new elements. The Byzantine Empire had briefly reconquered Italy, only to see it lost again to the Lombards. The Carolingian and Ottonian empires had revived the imperial title, but never fully controlled Italy's growing cities. Communes had surged up from below, claiming self-government and defeating emperors in battle. Those communes had then transformed into signorii, as strongmen consolidated power. The papacy had defeated the empire only to fall into schism and scandal. Through all of this, Italy never stopped changing, never froze into a single pattern. It remained restless, creative, and haunted by its Roman past. Medieval Italy was a long, complex dream between two awakenings, the fall of Rome on one side and the Renaissance explosion on the other. In that medieval dream, Cities learned to govern themselves through elected councils. Merchants learned to accumulate capital and wield political power. Artists learned to represent human beings with psychological depth and physical realism. Scholars rediscovered classical texts and began thinking about human experience in new ways. When we think of the Renaissance, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, the Medici, we're seeing the culmination of centuries of Italian urban development, political experimentation, and cultural innovation. The Renaissance didn't spring from nowhere. It grew from medieval Italy's extraordinary combination of wealth, freedom, competition, and classical inspiration. If you've made it this far in our journey from Romulus Augustulus to the eve of the Renaissance, you've witnessed how a fractured, violent, chaotic Italy nonetheless created the foundation for one of history's greatest cultural flowerings. Subscribe to explore what happens next as medieval Italy transforms into the Renaissance and Italian artists, thinkers, and politicians reshape European civilization.